Bueno, mi presentación se titula Amazonía viva, humanidad segura, transnacionalismo político indígena, ciberactivismo y redes sociales. Y bueno, como decía Miranda, se enmarca en mi investigación de tesis. Es una pequeña parte, es un caso de estudio el que les voy a presentar, que habla sobre transnacionalismo político indígena. ¿Vale? Entonces, para empezar, primero explicarles un poco cómo surgió esta idea. Y bueno, para eso definir lo que es transnacionalismo, que la definición como más usada es que son procesos por los cuales los inmigrantes forjan y sostienen relaciones sociales múltiples que unen sus sociedades de origen y de asentamiento. Pero en este caso yo veía una limitante con los pueblos indígenas porque no todos los casos que he estado estudiando llevan a cabo un proceso migratorio. ¿Vale? Entonces estaban esas limitaciones, pero de igual manera yo veía que habían relaciones transnacionales. Entonces lo quise complementar con lo que dice Bryce Caffey, que habla del transnacionalismo como interacciones regulares a través de fronteras nacionales, cuando al menos un actor no es un agente estatal o no opera en nombre de un gobierno nacional. En este caso serían los pueblos indígenas u organizaciones indígenas. ¿Vale? Entonces, quise enfocarme en esta investigación porque es la forma que ellos tienen para hacer activismo político, pero que ya no se queda solamente en el Estado-nación de donde ellos pertenecen, sino que también ya trasciende las fronteras y por lo cual ellos han sabido hacer de lo transnacional un instrumento político para darse visibilidad en el mundo. ¿Vale? Entonces, aquí quise hacer un pequeño resumen de las demandas indígenas. Las demandas indígenas realmente son múltiples. Hay algunos que son bastante específicos según pueblo indígena o territorio o región, pero estas son como las más... aquí están en casi todas las partes y en casi todas las regiones del mundo, ya sea en Asia, en América, Norteamérica también. Y en esta ocasión mi investigación se centra específicamente en dos, que es el de voz y organización y el de tierra y territorio, ¿vale? Aunque igual involucra en otras medidas educación indígena o salud indígena, pero esos son como los más importantes dentro de mi investigación. Entonces, lo que yo estoy haciendo para mi tesis es proponer una tipología entonces de tipos de transnacionalismo político indígena. Esto lo hice a través de una matriz de análisis, donde tomé cerca de 200 organizaciones indígenas, donde analicé sus objetivos, los programas que llevan a cabo, si es que existen o no relaciones transnacionales con otros organismos, entre otros aspectos. Y entonces los pude clasificar de la siguiente manera, estando primero el transnacionalismo político indígena migratorio, que como dice, hay un proceso de migración de parte del pueblo indígena o ciertos representantes de este pueblo. Y para ese caso estoy trabajando con el colectivo Trabún, que es un colectivo mapuche que está aquí en Barcelona y que hace un activismo político para apoyar al pueblo mapuche que está tanto en Chile como en Argentina. Por otra parte también está el de pueblos transestatales, que en ese caso voy a trabajar con los Inuit, que es un solo pueblo indígena, pero que está repartido, por decirlo de alguna manera, en 4 estados-naciones. Está en Alaska, que pertenece a Estados Unidos, está en Canadá, en Groenlandia y en Chukotka, que se pronuncia, que es parte de Rusia. Entonces, lo que voy a trabajar con ellos es las limitaciones que ellos tienen para trabajar y funcionar como un solo pueblo indígena, pero perteneciendo a 4 estados-naciones. Pero lo que les voy a presentar ahora es este tercer tipo, que es el institucional, y que en este caso estoy trabajando con Cuenca, que es la coordinadora de las organizaciones indígenas de la Cuenca Amazónica. Cabe destacar que esta tipología pueden haber, ¿cómo se dice?
Solapamientos.
Gracias, solapamientos. Que el migratorio también puede ser institucional, y así no significa que solamente tiene que pertenecer a un solo tipo. Entonces, en el caso del institucional, como dice, las relaciones se hacen a través institucional, o sea, son organismos conformados por indígenas que se que establecen redes de defensa transnacional, generalmente con otros organismos tales como la ONU, Amnistía Internacional o distintas ONGs. ¿Vale? Esto realmente con el fin entonces de defender, en este caso de Cuenca, la deforestación de la Amazonía. ¿Vale? Cuenca, como se ve ahí en la imagen, representa a los 9 países que están dentro de la Cuenca Amazónica. La Cuenca Amazónica es todo lo verde que se ve. Está Colombia, está Ecuador, Perú, Bolivia, Brasil, Guyana Francesa, Surinam y Guyana. Creo que nombré todos ahí. Y cada uno de estos países tienen una suborganización y estas son las que pertenecen a Cuenca, como se puede ver aquí en esta imagen. Entonces, Cuenca sería la macroorganización que involucra a todas estas mesoorganizaciones, AIDC, FOAC, APA, que representan a cada uno de los pueblos indígenas de los países que les mencioné. Y estas organizaciones, a su vez, entonces se conforman por distintos pueblos indígenas y organizaciones de base. En el caso de Colombia, estas organizaciones de base eran cerca de 200, entonces por eso no puse todos los nombres, pero para que vean la magnitud de las redes que establece tan solo Cuenca a nivel regional. Pero además establece redes con otras organizaciones tales como ONU, como les decía, Amnistía Internacional, tal como se puede ver en esa imagen, que estas son algunas de las organizaciones que son tipo patrocinadores para los eventos que hacen o que les presta consejos, que se organizan en el caso de cuando empezó el COVID, los webinars y todo eso. Y bueno, también todos los años Cuenca participa en la COP, y eso está financiado también por las Naciones Unidas. Ellos van a todas estas instancias a donde los pueblos indígenas tienen voz. Entonces, ese ha sido como la gran introducción, pero mi tema específico para Cuenca lo estoy centrando en lo que es el ciberactivismo. Esto más que nada debido al COVID, como no pude viajar y ver el activismo que ellos llevaban a cabo in situ, tuve que cambiar mis objetivos y mi metodología de trabajo, y también ellos lo tuvieron que hacer. Entonces lo vi como una buena oportunidad para saber cómo ellos también se estaban adaptando a esta nueva realidad. Y claro, entonces, según definiciones o lo que se ha hablado de ciberactivismo, es que el Internet ha contribuido a que la política y el activismo en las redes sean utilizados por diversos grupos sociales, incluso los que antes eran excluidos históricamente, como en este caso los pueblos indígenas. Pero también quisiera destacar que sería como un error pensar que el ciberactivismo indígena empezó ahora con el COVID o ahora que existe Facebook, Twitter o Instagram. Y por eso quise poner aquí el ejemplo del Network Zapatista, que el movimiento zapatista, que empezó en 1994, ya empezó a utilizar el ciberactivismo a través de listas de difusión de correo electrónico para poder visibilizar el conflicto que estaba ocurriendo en México, y además muchas ONGs y organismos les enviaban dinero en apoyo para su movimiento. Entonces, claro, ahora es mucho más fácil poder llevar a cabo el ciberactivismo por Facebook, Instagram y Twitter, pero esto era algo que ya venía hace mucho tiempo. En el caso de Cuenca, el ciberactivismo que ellos realizan es más que nada a través de Facebook. Lo que estoy haciendo actualmente, y por eso no les puedo presentar como datos concretos porque todavía estoy trabajando en eso, es analizar 3 periodos de tiempo. Uno es pre-COVID, que es de octubre del 2019 hasta febrero de 2020. Después de marzo de 2020, ya cuando empezó COVID, como gran pandemia, hasta julio de 2020, y después de julio de 2021 hasta noviembre del 2021. Entonces estoy analizando cuántas noticias y publicaciones se compartieron a través de Instagram, Twitter y Facebook, el alcance que tenían estas noticias, si es que hay alguna variación, si es que antes publicaban más o menos, qué tipo de actividades se realizaban. Les puedo decir por ahora que Instagram lo tenían desde 2018, pero aún así entre octubre de 2019 y abril de 2020 no tuvieron ninguna publicación. Entonces lo empezaron a usar más que nada después de COVID, porque como no podían hacer más activismo in situ, tenían que usar las redes sociales. Twitter lo tienen desde el año 2011 y Facebook desde el 2019, pero aún así utilizan más Facebook y las personas también interactúan más a través de Facebook que de Twitter. Dan más reacciones a las publicaciones, más comentarios y más veces compartidos también. Y bueno, como se ve aquí arriba, hay algo que se llama el grito de la selva, que también es algo que empezaron a implementar en mayo, si no me equivoco, del 2020, que es un podcast que habla sobre los conflictos que hay en la Amazonía, a veces algo específico de Coica o de algún pueblo indígena o de alguna organización. Son capítulos de cerca de 10 minutos, entonces cuando tengan tiempo les recomiendo escucharlo. Es bastante interesante escucharlo, además desde un punto de vista no académico, sino desde el conocimiento indígena. Entonces es muy interesante. También tienen un canal de YouTube a donde han subido muchos videos, obviamente, de los webinars realizados o documentales también. Ahora último, este año, si no me equivoco, sacaron esta revista institucional digital que ya va en la segunda edición, que también habla de los conflictos internos de la Amazonía, sobre todo relacionados al medio ambiente, la deforestación y bueno, temas de minería y tal. Y bueno, estos son imágenes que saqué del Instagram y del Facebook, por si los quieren buscar, los quieren seguir. Siempre están actualizando todas sus noticias, o sea, diario hay mínimo 5 publicaciones en Facebook o Twitter, entonces son bastante activos con respecto al uso de las redes sociales. Y bueno, algunas reflexiones casi finales, porque como me queda todavía mucho que analizar. Bueno, estos dos temas aquí están relacionados, que hay un empoderamiento indígena entonces en lo que es el mundo digital, que genera cierto equilibrio entonces entre estos grupos hegemónicos y grupos subalternos, en este caso que serían los pueblos indígenas, ¿vale? Pero a la vez, y esto queda como para una conversación si alguien está interesado, es el esencialismo, que es ser indígena. Y esto lo quise poner más a nivel personal, porque yo soy también indígena y muchas veces a mí me dijeron, si tú fuiste criada en ciudad o si vives en ciudad, entonces tú no eres mapuche. Entonces, claro, el uso de la tecnología significa que uno es menos indígena, cómo uno también puede ir desarrollándose y cómo la identidad cultural también va avanzando según los nuevos mecanismos e instrumentos que uno tiene, en este caso, para hacer activismo. Muchas gracias.
So, yes, we're going to be presenting today a project that we're working on with people in my lab, the Lazar lab. So I want to thank Jen, who helped me a lot with analysis, David and Isor, obviously, and here Kenny also helped a lot with building the data infrastructure that I'm going to be using for this project. So I hope I try to make this as useful and nice for everyone in the audience. I hope it is, otherwise please ask questions. And yes, so quick overview of my talk today. So what I'm focusing on is on follower relationships on Twitter, and basically who follows who on the platform, and use a data set of more than 1 million Twitter users in the United States, and we have who they follow on the platform, and we have these users matched to a voter file data in the US. I'm going to explain a bit better this later, but basically this means that we have some demographics for these users. We have age, race, ethnicity, we have sex, we have some measure of the or partisanship identity in the United States, and the location where they live. And with this data, we're well equipped to look at how similar they are, these people in the data, with the people they follow on Twitter. So we look at basically homophoby. Okay, so I want to now go get a bit of like a more theoretical background on my research on this project. And I think backing up a bit, it's interesting to think of internet and social media relationships as a potential arena where traditional, say, network formation mechanism maybe don't play a role as big as for offline ties. So in my offline relationships, I go to work, I make friends in my high school, I meet people in my neighborhood. This is very constrained and generally leads to me having ties and networks with people who are similar to me. So the friends of my friends will be similar to me, so I become friends with them as well. And same for all these different environments and ways that we may build ties with other people. In the internet, in a social media platform on Twitter, I can follow anyone, regardless of where they live, regardless of who they are. So in principle, one could think, and in the early days of the internet 20 years ago, people idealistically thought that this will really help break down segregation and maybe polarization and these type of things. In reality, though, there's a kind of an open question, but we don't really know if it's still the case. And some research from Spanish done that structurally, offline and online networks are pretty similar. And in this project, we focus on one of these aspects of that really characterize networks and relationships, which is homophily. People tend to have relationships with people similar to them. And we look at this on Twitter. So kind of short, some data on Twitter in the United States. A quarter of the US adults use Twitter, and a significant portion of this use it to get news. So we have that it's a very important actor in the way that news disseminate and information disseminate in the United States. So in some sense, Twitter is kind of an interesting social media platform because it's between a social network. So people follow people that they know in real life, so ties are based on pre-existing ties, but also it's kind of an information network where you follow people that you just say things that you like, that you're interested in. And I will argue that this is makes it an especially interesting platform to study homophily because offline tie constraints will play a smaller role than, for say, Facebook, which is very based on offline relationships. So now comes some background also on homophily in general. I understand homophily here roughly as it's just the idea that there is more contact, more relationships between similar people than dissimilar people. And we know from a lot of research and literature that this is a really pervasive pattern for all kinds of relationships through different contexts. The question here, as I say, is is this true as well for online relationships? And research up to date, So first, before going to the question, I think we need to distinguish between different types of homophily. And first, what we have in mind often when we think about homophily is explicit choice homophily, so a preference. I am likely to become friends with someone who is similar to me. But then there are other factors that can make relationships be homophilous. So for example, if in a classroom, you have a minority group, which 90% of the classroom is from this group, majority, and then a minority group with 10%, people in the majority group will look homophilous because they will have a lot more ties to people similar to them, even if there's no preference for people similar to them. And inbreeding homophily is what we call this homophily above this choice, this opportunity set. And then I think it's also important to talk about more homophily, I call it segregation, which is simply the percentage of people that you have in the network who are like you. For example, on Twitter, if most people have white or Caucasian people in their network, this means that they get most information from white people. In this work, we don't really aim at really finding this choice homophily, this preference for similar others. This is very hard. It's confounded by algorithms. There's a lot of other things going on. We simply kind of want to measure segregation and inbreeding homophily. I'm going to get a quick review of homophily levels for offline and online ties. So in the US, it's well known, and in different contexts like classrooms or also core networks, that the race and partisanship kind of segregate networks a lot. It's kind of also high homophily for age and gender. For age and gender, for gender it's less high in general, but that depends a lot on the type of tie. For example, kin ties, family ties tend to be much more different across age and gender. The question here, as I say, is do we see similar patterns, high homophily for these variables, less for these others, in online arenas? And generally, the answer is yes, and this works across different platforms. There's studies on Facebook, studies on all the social media platforms like LiveJournal, studies on Twitter, and we see that even if there maybe there's somewhat less segregation depending on the platform, this kind of homophily behavior still works in online spaces. On Twitter, in particular, some research has found, especially studying race, homophily, there seems to be somewhat less than for offline relationships. There doesn't seem to be much gender homophily. There's more like inequality in the sense that both men and women tend to follow more men. There is some age homophily, but in general, there's not much research. And a lot of these studies, for example, for race, they infer race of users or gender based on the names, based on the profile pictures. And we know this has biases, so in the sense for data it will help because we have administrative information on these demographics from this or Twitter users. Then I want to talk also a bit about polarization and partisanship homophily in the US in general. I think it's nice here to back up a bit and first review a bit of what the literature says on social media and polarization. We see a lot of things, these things in the media, how social media algorithms make us become more polarized because we get all information from people like us, and the algorithms feed this by just giving us more information also that we like, so we end up in these echo chambers where we only see what we already agree with. Though in reality, there is kind of mixed evidence regarding these type of arguments. Some research, for example, finds that older adults in the US are the more polarized groups, but they are also the ones that use internet less, which is a bit hard to square with the idea that social media is causing polarization. On Twitter, there is substantial research that looks at conversations, so who tweets what, who retweets whom. The problem with this research, and they find very polarized environments, for example, looking at retweets about the elections in the US. The problem is that when you look at tweets and retweets, you end up looking at the small set of people who tweet and retweet a lot. And we know that in social media and Twitter, attention, content is very concentrated. A small set of people tweet a lot, and the majority barely tweets. So when you look at conversations, you end up looking at this small set of people who are very interested in politics and who generate a lot of content. Maybe you get a biased picture of the real polarization levels of, say, the average Twitter users. And when you go and you look at average Twitter users, who they follow, their behavior on the platform, you generally find that most users in reality don't really care so much about politics on Twitter. They follow news media organizations, or they follow sports or famous people, and the average user is kind of fairly exposed to this similar content. The advantage of data is that you have partisanship information external from anything that the user does in the platform. Other research often infers partisanship based on following your political elites or politicians. We don't have to do this, so we can have political orientation of everyone in the data, regardless of what they do on Twitter. And we are also able to compare this political homophily, the likelihood that you follow someone that is your same party. You can compare it to, for example, race segregation. And I think it's important to put this into context. Maybe don't worry so much only about polarization, but also about all the other divides that we have in society. Finally, the last piece of research or literature that we speak to with this project is the impact of geography in offline and online ties. So for offline relationships, so day-to-day relationships, we know it's very obvious that there's heavily constrained by where we are, where we live, where we go. And in online spaces, it seems that this shouldn't necessarily apply because, as I said, you can follow anyone or become friends on Facebook with anyone. But here the research is pretty clear. Distance is a very strong predictor of having a tie. So if you live closer to someone, it's much more likely that you will be friends with them or follow them, and that works across a lot of different platforms and social media spaces. So it's still that even in the spaces, relationships are virtual, but they are still affected a lot by what we do in real life. And I think also an interesting insight is that from this research, that distance is not the only way that geography impacts for the relationship formation. It's more about opportunity structures. So if you live in New York, there will be a lot of people in 1 kilometer around you, and you won't be very likely to follow them. But if you live in a rural area, there's very few people in 1 kilometer around you, and it's very likely that you follow them on Twitter or that you're friends with them on Facebook. So it's not so much distance, it's more like the amount of people that live between two locations that predicts having a pattern. And also some other things like state boundaries or country boundaries as well. In Twitter, it seems that there's a lot of long distance international ties, but short distance ties are more present than they would be by chance. Current research on Twitter hasn't really looked at this opportunity structure. That's something we can add as well, and we'll show this. So, again, we'll go ahead and start. Definitely honestly, it's a bit dry, sorry. Okay, I'm gonna now quickly describe the data that we have in the network that I'm using for this project. So as I quickly said before, we have a data set of Twitter users in the United States matched to voter file information. So people in the United States, when they go and want to vote, they register in this somewhere voter file in their state. They get the names, they get the demographics of their self-report, sex and age, for example. And then these voter files for each state are aggregated to the country level, and they are sold by commercial and you can get them for research, for example. So we'll have this data set with everyone in the US and their demographics, and if they're registered for a party or another. So when people in my lab match these Twitter users by using unique names within a single state, meaning that if there's only 1 million developers in Massachusetts on Twitter and in the voter file, we assume it's the same person. And then for this Twitter user, we use the demographics in the voter. As I say, these demographics include exact location, they include age, sex, race, ethnicity, party registration, and for those that don't have party registration, we have an inferred quality of voting demographics. So we have kind of a algorithmically predicted measure of partisanship. One advantage of this data is that it's real United US voters. So we have no bots, for example, and we have no media or mediation accounts that we end up seeing in other Twitter studies. So here there's no New York Times or Washington Post, for example. And in our previous research, we found it to be roughly representative of United States voters on Twitter. Then the next question is, how do we make a network out of these people? So we collected the follower list, so all the followers, so everyone that these users follow. This took 3 months to collect through the Twitter API, which is a lot of data. And then we make a network, in this diagram, of only relationships between panel members. So we have kind of a subgraph of the whole Twitter network with only ties between panel members. So we end up with a network with 1.1 million nodes and about 20 million edges, where each edge is a panel member following another panel member. On average, we have interviews, so everyone follows about 20 other persons, and is followed by 20 persons on average. Okay, let's get to the results now. So I'm going to be showing a bunch of these heat maps. I'm going to now unpack what is going on in a plot like this. So we have on the left the followers' partisanship identity. This is the heat map for partisanship. So we have Republican, Independent, and Democrat. And at the bottom, the partisanship of the follow user, also Democrat, Independent, and Republican. And in every cell, we have the probability of a tie between these groups. For example, here we have the probability that a Democrat follows a Republican. Probability here means the number of edges divided by the number of Democrat and Republican pairs in the network. So we see that very low values because most people don't follow each other per person on the platform. So it's easier to interpret these values with word normalize these heat maps so that we end up with a value that's relative to the others. For example, here we can interpret that Democrats are more than twice as likely to follow a Democrat than they are to follow a Republican. So they are pretty homophilous in the platform, while Republicans here are just somewhat more likely to follow Republicans than to follow Democrats, but much less. And Twitter is there's a lot more Democrats than Republicans. Maybe that's an explanation for that. Then we have the same plots, but for all the other variables. Here we have race, ethnicity. We see very strong homophily for Asians, also for African Americans, a bit less for Hispanics, and somewhat less for whites or Caucasians. Patterns are a bit more complex, but we also see generally kind of pretty red or heavy diagonal, meaning that people are more likely to follow people from the same age group. We have here in the top left the homophily of the younger users, which is very strong. They are much more likely to follow someone who's also 25 years or older than to follow older people. For sex, we see males tend to be kind of homophilous, but females not really. They are both as likely to follow the males and females, which means that probably it's more about males getting more attention, getting more followers on the platform than really an homophily pattern. Finally, we also have information on what people live, so we can get population density of the census tract, and we can bint this density in 10 decels. The bottom line is we have on the left in the first decile people who live in very low density areas, so in rural areas. On the right, people who live in city centers like in Manhattan or in the center of Chicago, places like this. We see everyone is much more likely to follow people in these high density cities because these are probably influencers, journalists, kind of important people, and people in rural areas here though have pretty high homophily, meaning they are very likely to follow people also in a rural area. Now let's move to distance. So in this plot I showed the probability of a tie of following someone on Twitter, depending on the distance here in the x-axis. So this is in logarithmic scale. It's a bit harder to interpret. But basically, this means there's a very strong decay in the probability of a tie as distance increases. So this kind of stops here. This is 1,000 kilometers. After 1,000 kilometers, the probability of a tie stays kind of similar. To get a better predictor of how geography impacts following someone on Twitter, we also calculated a measure we call population radius. This is related to what I said in the literature review. This is kind of a measure of how many people live between two locations. So imagine you have user A in Washington and user B in Philadelphia. We count how many people live in the circle, the radius, distance between A and B. This is kind of the opportunity set for A to follow someone else than B. And we found it's a better predictor to have a tie than distance. It's a similar plot with this measure. On the x-axis, we have this population in the radius that goes from 1,000 to the total population in the US, which is 300 million. In this case, the decay is clear, and the more people there are in between two locations, the less likely that people in two locations follow each other. To give it some kind of sense, because these logarithmic plots are a bit hard to interpret, here are some values. For example, if you are in the upper left here, you are very likely to follow someone of the 5,000 people around you, roughly. So it's like one or 200 probabilities that you follow them. But if you go from 1 million, then the probability of a tie is divided by 20. So there is a very fast decrease in the probability to follow someone as you go farther. Last, so here I'm gonna maybe skip this a bit fast, but up to now we've looked at this inbreeding homophily that I talked about. So we looked at probabilities of a tie, taking into account the volume of people in each group or the volume of people at a certain distance. Now I wanted to look also at raw segregation. So in some sense, if I'm a Democrat, how many people that I follow are also Democrats? And this is what these values here say. The average Democrat says 72% of the people they follow that are also Democrats. So this, while it doesn't take into account that there are a lot more Democrats in the platform, it says something about Democrats getting a lot more information from Democrats than from others. And we see that Democrats really dominate here. So in the left column, all Republicans and Independents have more Democrats than they have of any other party. So Republicans even have more Democrats in the people they follow than Republicans. also have some plots with the distributions of these values and only the averages. I don't want to delve too much into this, but the bottom line is there's a lot of variety. So some Republicans are very segregated, only for Republicans. Some Republicans are really not segregated, they only follow Democrats. Similarly, have similar tables and plots for the other variables. For race, we see that really whites, Caucasians dominate. So all races follow more whites on average than their own race, even if they have homophily when you take into account the number of people. Finally, well, here also for sex, we see that really males dominate a lot. So on average, the average male follows 70% of the people they follow is a male as well. While for females, it's kind of average, but even more males than females. It really says something about the content that people see in social media, how it tends to be much more generated or coming from males than from females. Age, also similar plots, is a bit harder to interpret, so I think we won't spend too much time. We see the purple line here is for people between 30 and 50 years old. They dominate a lot as well, so most people, the people they follow tend to be middle-aged, between 30 and 50. Younger people feel a bit more complex, so there's a lot of variety as well. Some young people only follow people also below 30, others follow a lot of people also between 30 and 50. Finally, similar plots for distance and for population radius. The distance in the left is more easy to understand. We have here the yellow line, meaning that in general, a lot of people, a majority of the people they follow, which are farther than 1,000 kilometers. But there's also a wide variation in these distributions. Some people follow a lot of people. For example, 5% of the users follow half of the people they follow are between 100 and 1,000 kilometers. So it depends a lot. It seems some people have networks which are very based on offline ties, so they follow people near, but then a lot of people follow a lot of people far. And this really states because when we see it through the probabilities, we see that the likelihood of a tie is much higher at shorter distances, but most people in the US live far. So when you look at total volume, you see that in general people have information coming in from longer distances. Finally, the last piece of analysis I wanted to show today is getting all these variables. We look at each variable, how it affects having a tie. We looked at them all alone, but then we can get all of this together and try to having a tie with unrestricted regression. So basically the idea is that we have all the ties together, all the variables together. We're able to see how each variable compares to the others, how they control one other. So yes, I should use an argument here for those who know what this is, but it's very hard computationally, so we shall log it. And yes, I think that's okay. So this is a table with a lot of numbers. These are exponentiated logistic regression coefficients, which can be interpreted as ratios of probabilities. We focus here, these are 5 models in the columns, model 5 in the right. We have probability here, and a Democrat follows a Democrat. It's actually readable from there, but basically probability that a Democrat follows a Democrat is twice the probability that a Democrat follows a Republican. We say in general a confirmation of what I saw in correlated analysis, though some reduction in the magnitude of the effects. For example, polarization becomes a lot abundance, so partisanship becomes a bit less salient. Population rate is very important. We also have a variable for being in the same state, so that if you live in the same state, you are 4 times more likely to follow each other. Take into account distance. So same state boundaries matter a lot. Another key thing to highlight is this may called the coefficient for Democrats mostly decreases when you include the population density variables. But yes, we can spend more time on this in the questions if you are interested. The Republican homophily also decreases here when you include distance. So some of the tendency of Republicans to follow Republicans seems to be driven by people following people close to them, because there's a lot of residential segregation in the US. So if you're a Republican and you follow people close to you, it's probable that they will be a Republican as well, even if you don't have any preference to follow other Republicans. And yes, it's against. Okay, so let's try to wrap this up and get a bit some few takeaways. Generally, we have seen this high homophily in this Twitter to follow network, except for sex, maybe for gender. Maybe less than for offline ties. Or if you look at the literature for homophily for offline ties, it's a bit hard to compare because homophily for offline ties tends to be for core networks, schools. So it's a very different context than Twitter. If we had quick ties or acquaintanceship ties, then this would be a more like a one-to-one comparison with Twitter relationships. We see that partisanship is important, so it's a variable that kind of matters to know if you're likely to follow someone else in the US. But similarly, no less than other variables like age or race, also living in rural urban areas. We see that geography is what most strongly associates with following someone. So if I know you are close to me, I am much more sure that you will follow me than if we both are Democrats, for example. So I think this speaks a bit to all this literature about polarization on social media. We see that a lot of other societal divisions, like where you live, your race, and your age, matter equally or more to know like how Twitter is structured, how people follow each other. And we've seen also that the following networks people follow are generally dominated by these groups: whites, Democrats, men, also middle-aged Twitter users. I think that theoretically, this is something maybe we can discuss more now. This has implications for information spreads on Twitter, how tends to be maybe staying segregated in some areas, people in some spaces, be it like geographic spaces, or also demographic, like people of the same race, tend to gather and reach to the same type of information. Also speaks to social cohesion, for example, because social cohesion is at the end of the day about people, very different people that are able to be connected or to reach similar information, and we think that's not really the case on Twitter. And also for algorithmic bias, because Twitter, for example, will recommend people you to follow on Twitter, and we see these are more likely to be white, Democrats, men, or middle-aged, because they are the ones that get the more attention also on the platform. This is ongoing work. I'm writing a paper now with this, so if you have feedback, ideas, or regarding theory, or regarding also more technical, that's very welcome. And yes, thanks.